So we're going to look tonight at a family of arguments that all deal with identity, and so they're all centered around problems with how the B theory implies identity. And so, in order to understand the issues here, we need to look at how these two different views, the A theory and in particular presentism. For now, I'm going to set aside the expanding block theory and just call it presentism. When I say A theory, I'm referring to presentism. And then obviously the B theory would be kind of our standard B theory. So we want to look at how each of them accounts for identity over time. And we're going to use Frank. And this the picture in the slide there, that's Frank. Actually, I have no idea who that is. That's a royalty-free stock photo model, but we'll call him Frank. And he's going to be our example for tonight. So the first thing we'll look at is what's called endurantism. Now the key word there is endure. And basically what we want to know is, why is Frank the same at T1, it's time 1, why is Frank the same at T1 as he is at T7? And the endurantism view is going to say that Frank is the same because Frank endures from T1 through till T7. So why is it that it's the same Frank at T7 than at T1? Well, it's the same Frank because he's endured through time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay. So now we're going to look at perdurantism, which is the B theory model. Now you'll notice that B theory denies that temporal becoming is real. So there's no sense in which Frank at T1 endures through T2, T3, T4, because time isn't really moving. That's just a sort of a perspective type of thing. And so really what Frank is he's sort of a collection of three-dimensional objects. Instead of being just the one being that moves through time, rather Frank is the collection of these spatio-temporal parts. And they call him a perduring object, the root word being perdure. So for me, the way I think about it is like if you take a sponge and you push it through a screen, like a kitchen filter or something, you'll see all these little bits that come through the holes in the screen. It's all one sponge, but you see these separated bits. Now in that view, there's actually a sponge on the back of the screen, and perdurantism there isn't. There's just these three-dimensional parts. But that kind of gives you the idea of what we're getting at here, is that each of these are part of Frank, but Frank is actually the collection of all of these three-dimensional parts. Now what's really key here, this is slide 4, is that each of these parts is a different three-dimensional object. So T2 Frank, for example, has different properties. It's a different substance. The atoms and molecules that exist at T2, there's no sense in which they endure through time to become the atoms and molecules at T6. It's a different three-dimensional object, separate and distinct. It has different properties. Frank at T2 might be, thinking about work, and at T6 he might be sleeping or something. So he could have different properties. He might be 6 years old at T2 and 30 years old at T6, whatever the time may be. And so it's really important for understanding all of the issues with perdurantism to have this really clear, that we're not talking, most of when I studied this, the difficulties I had in understanding the material was I would sort of import in my A theory thinking and then apply it to B theory arguments. But we really have to keep those separate and distinct. So is the difference here clear on how B theory answers the question, what is Frank, and how A theory answers the question, what is Frank?
Yeah, no, it seems to be reasonably clear. I think that, they're pretty good ways of looking at it, and I mean you've explained it very clearly. So
perfect, cool. So the first problem with perdurantism, we'll call it the B theory. Just it's easier for me to say that a million times. The first problems with, I put it on every slide, so I guess I'll have to say it, perdurantism. The first problem with it is we ask, how does Frank change over time? How does Frank change over time? And B theory's answer is he doesn't. he doesn't change at all. In fact, each different temporal location of Frank is just a whole different three-dimensional object, different center of consciousness, different everything. And I got an anonymous quote that kind of illustrates some of the issues of this. He says, "This seems to me a crazy metaphysic. If I have had exactly one bit of chalk in my hand for the last hour, then there is something in my hand which was not in my hand 3 minutes ago, and indeed is such that no part of it was in my hand 3 minutes ago. As I hold the bit of chalk in my hand, new stuff, new chalk, keeps constantly coming to be in my hand. That strikes me as obviously false. And so we can see, like, that seems to be a problem, right? I mean, we constantly have Frank, as we're talking to Frank, there's just new Franks. There just keeps new Franks keep coming into be, and that surely is not how it seems to us. It surely doesn't seem to us in this conversation. There's not new Jaspers, that I'm talking with, and surely that seems to be problematic. Does that kind of make sense to you as far as why that would be an issue?
Yeah, no, it does. It reminds me of when we were looking at philosophy of identity, when we were talking about in terms of like previous selves, do we still consider them the same person? For example, if I committed a crime,
Yeah.
And then a year later I was convicted of said crime, can I just say, oh, I'm not the same person anymore?
Yeah.
Um,
This person's not guilty.
yeah.
Yeah.
You must say that this Frank is it Frank?
Yeah, Frank. Yeah, we'll go. I don't know how often they have Frank in Australia, but that's we'll call him Frank. So funny you should mention that. That's another problem with the B theory. Is I use praiseworthy because just to be more positive about it. But suppose Frank at T1 saves a cat from a tree, and then T7 Frank is praised for it. Well, why? The center of consciousness at T7 had nothing to do with saving that tree. He didn't risk the three-dimensional object, the physical body at T7. He was never at any risk. He wasn't put, that body wasn't put out. In fact, nothing in the decisions or will or consciousness of Frank at T7 had anything to do with saving the cat at T1. And so on the B theory, where these are separate three-dimensional objects, one not becoming the other, it's really hard to see how Frank at T7 should be praised, morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy, for what happens at T1. And in fact, to use your example, if the guy's in court, and he, saying like, well, that he's being charged with a crime and he's being convicted, he's not the one who committed the crime, but I guess he shouldn't be too worried because he's also not the one who's going to go to jail. So it's yet another Frank. And so, it's a pretty serious problem there partly because like, it seems very obvious to us that people really are praiseworthy when they do good things, or really are, blameworthy when they do bad things. And so it just seems to be very counter to our understanding of the world, very counter to how we see things in order for that to be the case. So you brought up that example, so I'm assuming that that's clear enough to you. Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.